Welcome back to The Explainer. If you're a clinician or a therapist, you know exactly what we're tackling today. We're looking at one of psychology's most frustrating clinical presentations. Why do adult patients, who absolutely swear they will never be like their parents, end up adopting their absolute worst traits? It's a heartbreaking paradox, right? Well, understanding the clinical mechanics behind this is literally the very first step in helping your patients break that cycle. Okay, let's dive right into this core paradox with a seriously powerful insight from Bishop William Duncan. He says, what you hate, you become. What you forgive, you are freed from. And as Dr. Faith Oniya's psychological research reveals, this isn't just nice philosophy. It is hardwired psychology. It perfectly frames the emotional stakes of the clinical work we're doing in session. Since we are dealing with some complex theories today, here is our roadmap for this clinical workshop. We'll start with the paradox of repetition, then look at the unconscious mechanics, explore why willpower fails, trace the echoes in adult life, weigh resentment versus forgiveness, and finally, cover breaking generational cycles. All right, let's jump straight into part one, the paradox of repetition. So, when your patients come in and report that they're acting exactly like the parent they swore they'd never emulate, object relations theory gives us the why. I want to validate this right out of the gate. This is not a lack of willpower on your patient's part. See, children don't just passively watch their caregivers. They deeply internalize them as their primary blueprint for how human relationships work. They absorb both the good and the bad representations. So even when a client is consciously resisting a parent's behavior, those neural pathways formed in early childhood, they are deeply embedded in their psyche. Which brings us to part two, the unconscious mechanics. We see this all the time in clinical practice, right? Repetition compulsion. First described by Sigmund Freud, this is the unconscious tendency to basically recreate circumstances that mirror earlier trauma. Our patients' brains unconsciously compel them to live out behaviors or relational dynamics pertaining to their parents' past existence. It's kind of like they're reading from an invisible script they never consciously chose to write. Why? Because the human nervous system naturally gravitates toward whatever is familiar. And then there's another tragic mechanism: identification with the aggressor. Think about a child feeling utterly powerless against harsh parenting, whether that's yelling, neglect, or overly strict discipline. To survive, they might unconsciously adopt their aggressor's behaviors as a psychological defense mechanism. It gives them a fleeting sense of power and control, rather than feeling like a total victim. But the tragic irony? It embeds the exact behavior they hate deep into their own developing personality structure. Now, here is where the hard science comes in. This all happens because early brain development kicks in way before conscious, critical thinking emerges, meaning implicit memory stores emotional patterns as physical, bodily sensations, not as narrative stories. Your patient's nervous system literally labels these familiar, even painful patterns as safe, just because they're predictable. This is exactly why traditional talk therapy alone often falls short with these clients. To really make a difference, we have to incorporate body-centered methods to release the implicit trauma stored way back in those early developmental stages. Moving on to part three, why conscious willpower fails. Selma Freyberg's concept of ghosts in the nursery brilliantly breaks down how our conscious vows get totally hijacked under pressure. Let's look at a clinical vignette. A patient vows, "I will never yell like my mother did." But then, parenting exhaustion hits. That stress activates her implicit bodily memory. Suddenly, she repeats the behavior. She yells. And the immediate result? Overwhelming shame. She thinks, "I swore I'd never do this." And the cycle just loops back around until we intervene to help her transition from reactive hatred to deliberate choice. The crucial thing to understand about that shame is this: small children treated badly by their parents will always, and rather strangely, blame themselves, not their parents, for their injuries. They conclude, "I am bad," instead of "my parent is struggling." In your clinical practice, this shows up as adult clients who feel fundamentally flawed. They unconsciously believe they are destined to repeat these painful patterns because of that internalized childhood self-blame. And here's a wild twist. Hatred actually has to be taught. It doesn't come naturally to a child. So when patients actively bombard themselves with negative feelings and obsess over a parent's hated behavior, they're paradoxically keeping that exact behavior prominent in their consciousness. By hyper-focusing on what they hate, they are ironically reinforcing the very neural pathways we are desperately trying to help them escape. It's a complete trap. Let's look at part four, echoes in adult life. Out in the real world of adulthood, these unconscious mechanisms manifest super predictably in relationships. Let's take another clinical scenario. Say you have a patient raised by a financially irresponsible father. How do they react as an adult?
They might become intensely controlling about money with their spouse. They're effectively replicating the power imbalance they hated, just from the other side. Or an emotionally distant mother might result in an adult child who becomes an emotionally unavailable spouse. Their conflict resolution patterns tragically mirror their parents' approaches, even when they're consciously fighting it.
We see this carry over into family governance and authority structures too. Look at authoritarian parenting. It often produces rebellious children, or passive adults who simply cannot lead. On the flip side, permissive parenting produces children who lack boundaries entirely or who overcorrect to extreme rigidity later in life. These are predictable, often opposite extremes, created by adult clients desperately trying not to be their parents, but who totally lack a healthy middle ground to govern their own families.
This takes us to part 5, resentment versus forgiveness. There is a massive difference between a patient trapped in victimhood and one who is actively healing. Getting stuck in hate means obsessing over flaws, falling into black and white thinking, and remaining forever attached to the perpetrator. In therapy, we really need to frame forgiveness not as some moral imperative, but as a functional, clinical tool. The actual action of forgiveness releases that attachment. It breaks the unconscious identification, and it finally creates the psychological space needed for new neural patterns to form. Desmond Tutu hit the nail on the head when he said, by forgiving, you relinquish your right to seek revenge. You get freedom in return. That's the core takeaway here. Forgiveness is a functional tool for your patient's own personal psychological freedom. It's absolutely not an excuse-making mechanism for whoever hurt them. It is the literal clinical mechanism for how they sever the tie to the hated behavior so they can finally move forward. Let's bring it all together in part 6, breaking generational cycles. So here is a really practical checklist you can use during one-on-one sessions to help clients practice new responses. First, guide patients toward awareness without shame. Second, practice conscious reparenting, helping them notice when stress triggers that implicit memory. Third, use those body-based techniques we talked about to process the original wound and release stored trauma. Fourth, help them cultivate gratitude as a direct antidote to bitterness. And finally, encourage forgiveness as a deliberate action, not just a feeling. Now, processing all this trauma requires therapeutic witnessing and connecting present reactions to past experiences. But crucially, as clinicians, we can't ignore our side of the couch. We have to identify our own potential countertransference triggers. We absolutely must process our own childhood histories so we don't project onto our patients. That's how we maintain a grounded, truly safe space to help them understand their parents' unique handicaps and finally exercise that ghost in the nursery. We're going to wrap up this workshop module with a profound reflection you can pose to your patients. What is it costing you to continue acting out your parents' fears and biases? Understanding these psychological mechanisms empowers your clients to move from reactive hatred to conscious, deliberate choice. Because when they forgive what they hated, they liberate themselves from it. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer.